Here's every single example and case study in GCSE Geography Paper 1. Quick note before we begin that this video took me 4 weeks to compile, so I would massively appreciate it if you can hit that subscribe button. Now here are all of the examples and case studies screenshotted from the specification, and I will be going through all of them in chronological order, so make sure you check out the timestamps if you want to skip to certain areas. Now as you can see, it's all according to the specification in this video, so if you rely solely on this video for your revision, then you will be absolutely fine for the exam. Let's begin. Section A, the challenge of natural hazards. So let's look at the first example. In the specification it says, use named examples to show how the effect and responses to a tectonic hazard vary between two areas of contrasting levels of wealth. So we are going to look at Gorka, Nepal versus L'Aquila, Italy. So just some general background information. The earthquake that happened in Nepal happened in April 2015. It was a 7.8 magnitude, and Nepal is a low-income country. Now in Italy, it happened in April 2009. It was also a 7.8 magnitude, however, Italy is a high-income country. So the first thing we need to compare are primary effects. These are the immediate effects after the earthquake has happened. So in Nepal, 8,692 people died and there were 2,000 injuries, whereas in Italy, only 300 people died and there was 1,500 injuries. In Nepal, 3 million people were made homeless, whereas in Italy, 65,000 people were made homeless. In Nepal, 7,000 schools were destroyed and the cost of damage rounded up to be 5 billion, whereas in Italy, it mainly was hospitals and general buildings that didn't comply to building codes were damaged, and the estimated cost of the earthquake was 16 billion. So this often confuses people, but it's important to note that the cost of damage would be higher in the higher income country because all of their facilities and buildings that would have been destroyed are of a higher value than in Nepal. Now let's look at secondary effects. So what happens after? What are the triggers from the earthquake? In Nepal, there was an avalanche that happened on Mount Everest that unfortunately killed 19 people. In Italy, access to areas of the city were restricted because of unsafe buildings. There weren't too many things that happened in Italy apart from some landslides, whereas in Nepal, there was 100,000 landslides that were triggered by the earthquake. There was also evacuations due to the risk of flooding, and there was also landslides. And in Italy, there was just things like university applications being declined as less people wanted to study in the university. Finally, let's look at the responses. So immediate responses versus in Italy and Nepal. So in Nepal, there were rescue teams, medical support, water was provided by UK, China and India, and we can see that Italy didn't require as much support from a global standpoint because you can see that in Nepal there was the UN and the World Health Organization that was assisting and aiding, whereas in Italy it wasn't too much aid because Italy was already a high income country, so they said that they had enough money to support. However, that didn't stop charities from giving to Italy, so there was £170 million from the British Red Cross, and the EU also helped by giving 552.9 million from its major disaster fund. There were some temporary shelters set up in Nepal, however this wasn't as required in Italy. And finally, looking at the long-term responses. So in Nepal, we saw that buildings were constructed using stricter codes and regulations, and the same thing actually happened in Italy as well. Homeless people were rehoused and 7,000 schools were rebuilt. And areas that were affected by landslides were cleared and roads were repaired. But it's important to note that after 2 years, many of the destruction that had been caused by the Nepal earthquake had still not been renewed and removed because of the lack of funding. Whereas in Italy, pretty much after 2 years, everything was back into motion. There were no taxes paid by the residents during that year, the following year, and to encourage students to go back to the university, they actually dropped the fees for 3 years. So, a possible exam question that you could be asked is, to what extent does a country's ability to cope with the effects of a tectonic hazard depend on its wealth? So the fact that you'll basically be comparing the different responses, because we're talking about the ability to cope rather than the effects, and use examples from countries with contrasting wealth. So you can use these two examples that we just discussed. Now, I'll be going through answers to these exam questions in a future video, so watch out for that. Let's look on to the next example. Use a named example of a tropical storm to show its effects and responses. We're looking at Typhoon Haiyan, which happened in the Philippines. So, this is a nice table. In this case, we're not comparing it to something else, so you just need to remember the facts alone. So, primary effects: there were very strong winds, people were made homeless, electricity was interrupted, roads were blocked, there were obviously 6,000 deaths and 29,000 injuries, 4.1 million people were made homeless. There was the average cost of damage of 12 billion. Note, you don't have to remember all of these figures. I would say just at least three from each column is probably the maximum you need to do. There was a massive impact on also the crops and farming, as they were a central producer of rice, and that was severely inhibited. So you could actually see the long-term economic impacts from that typhoon. Looking at secondary effects, there were infection and diseases that were spread, power supplies were cut off for months in some areas, there was a lot of disruption to education, seawater, chemicals, and sewage was contaminated. An oil tanker caused an 800,000 litre oil leak, which actually contaminated so much of the fishing waters, and there was a lot of looting as well. So let's look at the immediate responses now. The government issued a televised warning to help people evacuate. 800,000 people actually saw that warning and were able to evacuate, and many people found refuge in a stadium in Tacloban. However, that stadium was actually flooded. So it was a worst possible outcome, where they were told to go to this area of refuge, and then that area of refuge actually had a terrible happenings and events happen to it. But apart from that, there were 1,200 other evacuation centres that were set up to help the now homeless. And after the storm, the airport was also reopened so that emergency aid could arrive, because again, Philippines is a low-income country, so it required a lot of help from other places. And that's why you see $1.5 billion of foreign aid. And finally, long-term responses. So there was a cash for work program which paid people to clear the debris and rebuild Tacloban. There were international charities, especially things like Oxfam, which helped replace fishing boats. You see that these charities, instead of just providing money, they tried to make it sustainable growth by investing in things that would allow the economy to regrow. There was also Build Back Better, which is a government's response to the typhoon, where it launched in 2014. It intended to upgrade the damaged buildings to protect them, and they also have a no build zone across a coast. And that means that if there was any storm, then there wouldn't be any buildings collapsing, because that's the main cause of death. When there's any typhoon or earthquake, the deaths are mainly caused by the buildings collapsing. Here's another exam question. Describe whether immediate responses are more impactful for the reparation after a storm than long-term responses. So just going back to that page there, you'll be comparing the last two columns. Let's look at the third one now. An example of a recent extreme weather event in the UK to illustrate 3 bullet points: causes, social, economic, and environmental impacts, and how management strategies can reduce the risk. So let's look at it. We're going to be looking at the Somerset Levels floods. So let's begin. Causes. Now, the causes of the floods were mainly by two things. There was a geographical factor, which was that between December of 2013 and February of 2014, the Somerset levels experienced three times the annual rainfall within that period. So it was a lot of rainfall. And the second factor is that the main rivers had not been dredged in 20 years, which just means that their capacity to take in water rather than make it flood was very, very reduced. Now let's look at the impact. So, firstly, the social impacts. 600 homes were flooded, villages were cut off from transport and electricity, and insurance prices soared. Environmental impacts. 11,500 hectares were flooded, as you can see in the background image now. There was a lot of standing water, which was now made toxic, and there was lots of mud and debris left. So it made it really hard for a lot of the farmland in the Somerset levels to regrow crops. And economic impacts. The total damage costed 80 million, the loss of 1.2 million in local businesses, but the greatest impact was the loss in tourism revenue because the Somerset levels attributed to 200 million in tourism annually, and there was therefore a loss in that. And finally, looking at the management strategies. So, warning systems were put in place before the flood. Communities were using sandbags to prevent entry of water into homes, and this was actually quite an effective measure. There were new pledges for regular dredging of the rivers, and there was also the widening of the River Sowe's channel so that it could take in more water. However, it's also important to note that there still is a future risk because obviously climate change is heightening the ability of rain and flooding and things like that. So more needs to be done. Now we're on to section B, the living world. Just a quick note here. So depending on the school that you go to or what you want to study, there are three possible case studies and you are only supposed to do two of them for the AQA specification. Now you can choose whichever two you want to do. However, in this video I'm only going to be going over tropical rainforest and cold environments, so hot deserts will not be gone through in this video. If you are fine with that, then you can learn and continue with this. If you wanted to do hot deserts, then find one online and you can do that instead of the other two. So let's begin with the tropical rainforest. Or before that, before the tropical rainforest, an example of a small scale UK ecosystem to illustrate the concepts of interrelationships between a natural system, an understanding of producers, consumers, decomposers, food chain, food web, and nutrient cycling. Now, I must admit that this example is actually probably the least asked about in the exam. That doesn't mean you shouldn't revise it, of course you should, but it's very vague about what you are supposed to know. So I try to give you as much information as possible so that you're aware. We are going to be looking at Epping Forest. So, Epping Forest is a deciduous woodland and it's found in northeast London. Some of you may have gone there before. The forest is over 1,000 years old, which means it was here since the last ice age, and therefore it's a site of scientific interest. It's a protected site, so it can't be destroyed for any reasons. So, a couple of bits of information about Epping Forest. There's a wide variety of native tree species. You've got beech, elm, oak, ash. You've got a shrub layer consisting of hazel, holly, grasses, brambles, fern, flowering plants. Remember, for this example, you need to be really aware of the different types of wildlife. There's 177 different species of lichen and moss. There's a lot of primary consumers like insects, small mammals, deer. There's 38 different species of birds. There's secondary consumers such as owls, adders, and foxes. There's 700 species of fungi, important decomposers, and also there are over 100 lakes and ponds, which provide the essential habitat for numerous fauna and flora. So just looking at the food web here, you need to be able to recall this in an exam context. So being able to identify what are the primary consumers, the insects, the worms, the caterpillars, and the beetle. And the secondary consumers, the things that consume those things, are rabbits, mice, small birds, and then the tertiary consumers, fox, owl, sparrow, hawk. And then it's also important to talk about how there's the decomposers, the 700 species of fungi, etc. Now, interdependence is an important topic in geography as well. So you need to know, how is the Epping Forest ecosystem interdependent, i.e., how does everything rely on one another? So the population of the foxes, how does that rely on the population of a producer, for example? And you can talk about the biomass, the litter, the soil, etc. So pause here, make a note of this diagram, and let's move on to the next one. This is a case study of a tropical rainforest, and you need to illustrate two key things here: the causes of deforestation and the impacts of deforestation. So, we are going to be looking at the Amazon rainforest. I'm aware some of you also do the Malaysian rainforest as well, so I might do a video in the future about that. Let's begin by looking at causes of deforestation within the Amazon rainforest. Now, a lot of us have this misconception that most of it is due to logging, but as you can see in this pie chart, it's only 2 to 3% of the causes of deforestation. The 65 to 70% majority is actually cattle ranching. There are 200 million cattle in Brazil on 450,000 kilometers of pasture. So you can imagine how much space that takes off of the forest. You've also got small scale agriculture. So this includes people that are doing subsistence farming, people who live in the Amazon rainforest and who are farming just to have enough food for themselves. We also can't forget that there's also the Aboriginal population. So when we're talking about the population growth, not just the Aboriginal population, but the people from Brazil who are putting the pressures on the land resources because of the overpopulation and there not being enough space to live in Brazil. Now, mineral extraction is actually a major part of Brazil's economy. 50,000 hectares in 2026 was used for mining gold, or 2016, I believe. So you can see they make a lot of money from gold and coal as well. Now let's talk about the effects of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. So you can see an image of an Aboriginal Amazonian person, and it actually disrupts their livelihoods, not only in the fact that logging, it removes their home, but also to think about, they're also, as the population from Brazil are encroaching into them, they're also bringing a lot of diseases that are causing their population to die out. There's also a diminishing level of biodiversity. Deforestation is also causing the forest to dry out, and this can cause drought and wildfires. 100,000 species becomes extinct in the tropic forests yearly, and the loss of a single species can affect all of the others that are relying on that. We talked about interdependence, and therefore, as the biodiversity weakens, the system becomes it's exponential. It becomes exponentially weaker. Also, removing trees allows more sunlight to penetrate the forest floor. This is causing the soil to dry out, and the only reason why the soil is so fertile is because of the constant supply of water and the nutrition from the leaves falling. And if it's being exposed, then you're going to experience a lot of soil erosion. Now, when the trees are burned, the carbon is held in their trunks because a lot of the time logging takes a lot of effort. So instead, what they do, illegal loggers, they just burn the forest, and that can kill so many organisms, but also it causes all of the carbon that's held within the tree to be released into the atmosphere. Now, the soil of the atmosphere, we already discussed, is quite thin and it's devoid of nutrients, and therefore if you get rid of the trees, the nutrients will only decrease. So the soil will not be able to repopulate and grow more vegetation. Here's an example exam question. With reference to a case study, describe to what extent the economic benefits of deforestation outweigh the losses. Now, I already said that for hot deserts, we're not going to be going through this case study, but here is the information if you wish to go through that. But now we're going to be looking at cold environments. So you need to know a case study of a cold environment, and the two main things are looking at the development opportunities and the challenges of developing there. Now, this case study is slightly shorter than the Amazon rainforest, so it's a bit nicer to memorize. And we are going to be looking at Svalbard, Norway. Now, Svalbard, Norway is basically a group of islands, an archipelago. That's what a group of islands is, that exists between Norway and the North Pole. It has a very small population of only 3,000 people, and it's the only visa-free zone in the world. So anybody can live there and work there regardless of your country or your citizenship. So let's look at the development opportunities in Svalbard. You've got mineral extraction. So coal mining is its main economic activity, employing 10% of the population. There's a lot of energy development. The island has the potential to meet its energy needs through solar energy during the summer, where there's 24 hours of sunlight, and that can actually sustain them through the winter, where there's 24 hours of darkness. The fishing industry is also quite rampant. There's over 150 different species of fish available, and Norway is the world's largest fish exporter, and much of that is contributed by Svalbard. In terms of tourism, Svalbard experiences 30,000 tourist visits annually, and that's updated by 2016, so it might be more than that. And there's a lot of adventure tourism in hiking, kayaking, riding snowmobiles, and this generates 2 billion 1 year. Now let's talk about the challenges to development. Now, this is quite easy to think about. Firstly, the extreme temperatures. Winter temperatures can drop below minus 30 degrees Celsius. It is extremely difficult to work in those conditions, as you can imagine. Buildings and infrastructure. So it faces a lot of issues with permafrost. It makes it really difficult to construct because if they are building buildings on top of these frost and then it melts, it causes the building to then be uneven and it just reduces the stability of it. Roads are built on raised gravel beds to ensure that the heat transfer, which can thaw the permafrost away. And another issue that Svalbard faces is that it's quite inaccessible. It's a very remote region, relying on transport such as planes and ships for access to the place. And also within Svalbard itself, it's very difficult to get transport. They have to use snowmobiles, and things like crossing frozen rivers can be very dangerous. Use a case study to describe the opportunities for developing energy and fishing in cold environments. We are now on to section C, which are physical landscapes in the UK. Now, it's the same situation here. I will be going over coasts and glacial landscapes. I'm not going to be going over rivers in this video. Maybe in a future video I will go over it, so make sure you know that. Let's begin by looking at coasts. So the first one is an example of a section of coastline within the UK to identify its major landforms of erosion and deposition. So the geology of the Holderness coast is boulder rock, so it's kind of soft clay, and it experiences a lot of destructive waves. Now, a combination having very soft geology and having very strong destructive waves means that it's going to definitely face a lot of erosion. So that's why it's a really good case study looking at coastal processes and features. So you've got lots of erosion and deposition. There's exposed chalk of Flamborough, which provides examples of erosional features. You've got a lot of caves, arches, and stacks. You can see in the diagram on the left, you've got a lot of diagrams which we can talk about. Now, there's a lot of coastal management central at Hornsey and Mapleton, and this is because there's a lot of population living there, so you want to protect them. And some of the management strategies include hard engineering solutions, and you've got erosion, which is happening at Skipsea as well. And it illustrates the human impact of erosion in areas where coastline is not being defended. Now, Spurn Point, which you can see at the end here, is highlighting longshore drift of the Holderness coast, and it's an excellent example of a spit. So 3% of the material eroded from the Holderness coast is actually deposited at that spit, and it's highlighting the struggles of erosion as well. So moving on to the next example, which is an example of a coastal management scheme to show the reasons for management, the strategy itself, and the resulting effects and conflicts. So we will be looking at the Lyme Regis. Now you can see the different coastal management strategies here. Sorry, the title was kind of blocking some of the writing. You've got the North Wall Rockery, so rock armour. Cliffs being stabilised by nailing, piling, improving drainage, wide sand and shingle beaches. There's a harbour wall and a recurved seawall. So you can see, hopefully, through this image, the different things that have been happening. Now, don't worry, you do not have to note this down because we are looking at the different stages in this image here. So the first phase was involving the construction of a seawall and promenade to the east of the mouth of the river. There was an emergency cliff stabilization. So the thing that caused all of this to be set in motion about trying to protect the coast is because, as you can see in the previous image, there's a lot of population that could be affected by any of the floods or any of the waves kind of going closer and closer to their homes. You can see a lot of them live very dangerously close to the coast, and therefore it's vital that they are protected. And that's why this scheme began. So we saw in phase one, there were different seawall constructions, and it was actually completed during 2003 to 2004, and it improved the drainage. That was phase one. Phase two was extensive improvements on the seafront, so the construction of sea walls, the creation of a wide sand and shingle beach, the extension of the rock armour to protect the harbour wall, the cob, and to the eastern end of the seafront to absorb the wave energy. Now, phase 3 was never put into practice, but phase 4 was, which was the construction of defences to protect the coast to the east of the town. The £20 million project involved building a seawall in front of the existing wall. 480 homes were therefore protected as the cliffs were stabilised by nailing, piling, and improving it. So let's now look at the positive and negative effects of the coastal management schemes at Lyme Regis. So positively, there have been a significant improvement in the attractiveness of the seafront and beach due to the nourishment and wide promenades. So remember, it could be a tourist attraction, and if it looks better, then more tourists will want to go there, and therefore they can generate revenue. Negatively, there have been a lot of conflicts as the visitor numbers have increased because local people have experienced increased traffic congestion, increased litter due to the tourism. The new defences have actually withstood recent stormy winters, which is good, it shows that it's working. However, some people feel that the new coastal defences have actually spoilt the natural coastal landscape, so it's very subjective. The harbour is better protected, benefiting the fishing industry as well. And so it's not only propagating just tourism, but also the fishing industry. However, some may believe that the new defences actually interfere with the natural coastal processes. And if they're going to try and stop erosion happening there, then erosion will just happen more further along the coastline, on the neighbouring towns. So that can also cause future conflicts as well. Now we're going to move on to the example of an upland area in the UK affected by glaciation to identify its major landforms of erosion and deposition. So we're going to be looking at Snowdonia in Wales. So this is a diagram which has a lot of writing on it, but I'm going to only illustrate three key things here that you need to look at and understand. So firstly, you can see Egan here. And what Egan is an example of a ridge between two corries. And whenever you have a ridge between two corries, it's called an arête. If it was between three corries, then we would call it a pyramidal peak. So here is the actual image, the real life photo of it. The next thing I wanted to draw your attention to was Llyn Ogwen Loeb, i.e. a mountain river, a tarn, that's found within the corries. So within that armchair shape, you've got a little river, and it's called Llyn Ogwen, so that's an example of that. You can see in the image here what that looks like. And finally, we're looking at Nant Francon, and that is an example of a glacial trough, a U-shaped valley that could not have been created by the river Ogwen, because if you look at the image here, you can see this U-shaped valley part, and the river is just about visible here. The river is way too small to have created this massive U-shaped valley, so you know, therefore, that this has been created by glaciers. And this is a good example. So Nant Francon is a really good example of a U-shaped glacial trough. We're now going to move on to an example of a glaciated upland area in the UK, which is used for tourism to show what are the attractions, what are the social, economic, and environmental impacts, and finally, what are the management strategies to take care of those impacts. So, firstly, what are we looking at? We're looking at Lake District. So you can see a really beautiful map on the left hand side, and there's many different attractions of the Lake District that people are drawn to. Firstly, which is not actually put on here too much, but the landscape is beautiful and lots of people go there to see for sightseeing. There's also very scenic towns as well, like Ambleside, that are world famous. A lot of people go there for water sports like canoeing, paddleboarding, cruising, and fishing. And there's also a lot of extreme sports like rock climbing, abseiling, hiking, mountain climbing. There's a lot of cultural history as well, with it being the home of Beatrix Potter and the landscape that inspired poets like Wordsworth. So it's a very poetic landscape and it has so many benefits to offer, which is why it is so very popular. So now we're going to discuss the impact of tourism that is having on Lake District. So socially, 15.8 million people visit the Lake District every year. Now, if you consider the impact of that on the 40,000 locals, it is a lot to deal with. And it happens all year round. There's just as many winter visitors as there are summer visitors. 83% of the visitors also travel by car. Now, this causes severe congestion on the narrow, winding roads. There's also very high house prices, and the reason being that 20% of the properties are either second homes or holiday rentals. Hence, the people renting them or buying their second home tend to be quite wealthy. And this means that for the actual locals, they are unable to afford their housing in the local area. Also, the jobs in the tourism are typically quite seasonal and poorly paid. Looking at the economic impacts of tourism, the tourism revenue in the Lake District can rake in £3 billion in 2019, supporting hotels, shops, and restaurants. 15,000 local people are employed in tourism in the Lake District, working in the shops, the restaurants, the hotels. There are loads of businesses, such as adventure tourism, creating a lot of new jobs for people. And congestion slows businesses down, unfortunately, and communication. However, you can see that the majority of the economic impacts of tourism are generally quite positive. Looking at the environmental impacts of tourism, the main honey spot sites and footpath experiences cause considerable erosion, and there's a lot of litter and there's a lot of damages to the verges, especially in the uphill farmland. A lot of tourists leave the gates open and therefore the sheep end up running away, and it's not good for the farmers at all. Ecosystems are affected by the pollution from the cars and the boats, and farmland, as I said, is affected by the walkers leaving the litter and the trampling the crops, disturbing the cattle. There's a lot of lakeshore erosion, which is a continued problem around Lake Windermere. The tourists and locals do enjoy walking up by the lakeshore, but unfortunately, it's destroying the plant life and it's leading to the erosion of the area. So, management strategies. How can this be controlled? Well, for the traffic and parking, there's discounts for public transport, road networks being improved, and there's also controlled parking zones. Ambleside is a really nice village, so to minimize the congestion, you're only allowed to park there for certain times. There's a lot of footpath erosion. Paths have been resurfaced using the hard wearing materials like rocks and plastic mesh. A lot of littering signs have been put up to remind people to take their rubbish home. For the water and noise pollution, there's been limits to how much you can go in the water for and at what times. And for the house prices, there's been affordable house pricing and local occupancy schemes, which only allows the locals to buy some of the housing. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. There will be a paper 2 case studies and examples video coming out soon, so make sure you subscribe and share this resource. You can see the many GCSEs that I have and I put on offer. My aim is to get to 100,000 subscribers this year, so hopefully can you help me with that endeavour. Thank you so much guys, and all the best for your exams. See you soon.
If you want all grade 9s like me, subscribe now to Know for GCSE.